two eyes to see. Again, I wasn't a great imbiber of liquor. I may have gone to a speakeasy or so, I don't remember, but I'm not saying I didn't. But I wasn't an alcoholic or anything. Anybody with two eyes to see could see that this was a bad deal, that you were doing more harm than good. Now, in addition, I became an economist. And as an economist, I came to recognize the importance of markets and of free choice and of consumer sovereignty, and came to discover the harm that was done when you interfered with them. As a matter of fact, there was no very extensive attempt. The laws against drugs were passed in 1914. But there was no very great enforcement of it.
That was the Harrison Act?
The Harrison Act.
Yeah.
There was no very great enforcement of it until after World War II, by which time I had been able to see the harmful effects of price control, of rent control, of other attempts for government to interfere with market things. So it never occurred to me.
Was there any
single?
Excuse me. Was there any single event, anything you happened to witness that made an impression upon you, or was it?
No, there was no single event. It was a cumulative effect.
Of course, you know that there are those who say that Prohibition shows us that when Prohibition was over with, alcohol prohibition, that consumption dramatically increased, and that it would be a...
I beg your pardon. That's simply not true. That's not a fact. What is true...
It has been argued. That has been argued.
Well, you got to stop. You have statistically reported figures in the books on the amount of alcohol consumed. That went up sharply right after Prohibition. But that was illegal alcohol consumption. If you take, as I have done, a chart of alcohol consumption before and after Prohibition, alcohol consumption after Prohibition came back roughly to where it was before. And over the course of the period since then, if anything, alcohol consumption has been going down, not in absolute terms, but relative to the population and relative to the growth of income. For a time, it went up rather slowly, along with income, except with one exception. During World War II, it shot way up. But usually that's what happened during World War I. Of course, you never would have gotten Prohibition if you hadn't had all the young men away in France when the vote was taken, so that the women had an extraordinary influence on them. But the same thing happened during World War II. And then after World War II, it settled down again. And more recently, the consumption of alcohol has been going down on a per capita basis. So it simply is not true that there was a tremendous increase. So far as drugs itself is concerned, some years ago, Alaska legalized marijuana. Consumption of marijuana among high school students in Alaska went down. The Dutch in Holland do not prosecute soft drugs like marijuana. And they would prefer not to prosecute hard drugs, but they feel impelled by the international obligations they've entered into. And there's no doubt the consumption of marijuana by young people has gone down. And equally more interesting, the average age of the users of hard drugs has gone up, which means they're not getting any more new recruits. So the evidence is very mixed. There's no, but I have to admit that the one element of harm that the one negative feature of legalizing drugs is that there might be some additional drug addicts. However, I want to qualify that in still another way. The child who's shot in a slum in a pass-by shooting, in a random shooting, is an innocent victim in every respect of the term. The person who decides to take drugs for himself is not an innocent victim. He has chosen himself to be a victim. Mm-hmm. And I must say, I have very much less sympathy for him. I am not willing to impose, I do not think it is moral to impose heavy costs on other people to protect people from their own choices.
For us to understand the real root of those beliefs, how about if we just talk for a minute about free market economic perspective, that perspective, and how you see the proper role of government in its dealings with the individual?
The proper role of government is exactly what John Stuart Mill said in the middle of the 19th century in his essay On Liberty. The proper role of government is to prevent other people from harming an individual. Government, he said, never has any right to interfere with an individual for that individual's own good. Look, if you really, the case for prohibiting drugs is exactly as strong and as weak as a case for prohibiting people from overeating. We all know that overeating causes more deaths than drugs do. Why isn't it perfect if it's in principle okay for the government to say you must not consume drugs because they do you harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not eat too much because you do harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not try to go in for skydiving because you're likely to die? Why isn't it all right to say, oh, skiing, that's no good, that's a very dangerous sport, you'll hurt yourself? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I would bet that former drug czar William Bennett, some other folks along those lines, would probably suggest that the present sale and distribution of illegal drugs is in fact an enterprise which harms another person, and the government has to step in to protect the vulnerable.
It does harm a great many other people, but primarily because it's prohibited. Almost all, there are an enormous number of innocent victims now. You've got the people who are whose purses are stolen, who are bashed over the head by people trying to get enough money for their next fix. You've got the people killed in the random drug wars. You've got the corruption of the legal establishment. You've got the innocent victims of the taxpayers who have to pay for more and more prisons and more prisoners and more policemen. You've got the rest of us who don't get decent law enforcement because all the law enforcement officials are busy trying to do the impossible problem. And, not last but not least, you've got the people of Colombia and Peru and so on. What business do we have destroying and leading to the killing of thousands of people in Colombia because we cannot enforce our own laws? If we could enforce our laws against drugs, there would be no market for these drugs. You wouldn't have Colombia in the state it's in.
In a very important sense, is it not true that the entire discussion here, the entire drug problem, is an economic problem?
No, it's not an economic problem at all. It's a moral problem.
In what way?
The economics part of it is, I'm an economist, but the economics problem is strictly tertiary. It's a moral problem. It's a problem of the harm which government is doing. Look, I have estimated statistically that the prohibition of drugs produces, on the average, 10,000 additional homicides a year. It's a moral problem that the government is going around killing 10,000 people. It's a moral problem that the government is making into criminals people who may be doing something you and I don't approve of, but who are doing something that hurts nobody else. Most of the arrests for drugs are for possession by casual users. Now here's somebody who wants to smoke a cigarette, a joint, a marijuana cigarette. If he's caught, he goes to jail. Now, is that moral? Is that proper? I think it's absolutely disgraceful that our government, supposed to be our government, should be in the position of converting people who are not harming others into criminals, of destroying their life, putting them in jail. I don't see, that's the issue to me. The economic issue is strictly, the economic issue comes in only for explaining why it has those effects. But the economics reasons are not the reasons. Of course we're wasting money on it.
There are
10, 20, $30 billion a year. But that's trivial. We're wasting that much money in many other ways, such as buying up crops that ought never to be produced.